Okay, so why don't we talk a little bit about what happened as you finished up your schooling?
Okay, it sounds like dropping out of school is a bad thing, but remember, this was the Second World War. Most of the men had gone off to battle or would have jobs in the shipyards. This was a time when you needed working bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and even for young men in school, if they wanted to drop out and get a job in something like, say, working in the shipyards, the schools would give help to them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
This was a case of the principal and the school board helping a young man to drop out of school, which sounds kind of ridiculous today.
Yeah.
But they needed him. Now, of course, when the war got over and these guys had these jobs, back come the guys from the war and get their jobs back. That left the young men who had taken these jobs and been trained for them without anything to do. And that was a bad situation.
Mm.
Okay, that's the background of this thing. Well, it took me a long time to decide whether to drop out or not. Um, I didn't have too many people to advise me, um, and besides which, this was a respectable thing to do at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I guess you were serving. You were serving the war.
you're
Yeah,
serving
yeah.
your
There's
country,
nothing bad about it at all.
and so I went ahead and dropped out and got assigned to work in a Chevrolet automobile dealership. Now remember, I knew nothing at all about engines other than my old boat.
Boat motor.
So they took me on, they showed me around and put me under the wing of an old mechanic, kind of heavy set guy called Trojan or Trogdon. I never did know which was the correct pronunciation, but he was a very fatherly type. And he was the only one of this type, and I guess that's why I went to, because he assigned me, and I was to be taught the art of automobile repair. That was his assignment for me. It was just going to help him, but basically become a helper.
Mm-hmm.
And this was great because I liked him, he liked me, and I learned fast.
And you liked apparently working on auto engines,
Oh,
right?
I loved working on auto
Uh-huh.
engines. The other guys in the shop that were left, which are older guys, because the younger had all been drafted.
Uh,
Um, we got along fine, and got to be almost buddies. And sometimes they would go out to get a beer or something, and I would go over there and not have to. In some cases, they made me get a chocolate malt or something, but they couldn't get a beer. But I went with them.
mm-hmm.
And later, when they were going out to say go to a burlesque show at night, they'd invite me to come along. And so that's how I got into the burlesque show as a kid rather than an adult, and nobody had said no.
So you were an accompanied minor, as they say.
Now, there were things I could have learned there that I chose not to.
Mm-hmm.
There were the usual whorehouses and so forth. And obviously, I got exposed to some of this just by being there, going to the burlesque show and walking the streets with some of these mechanics and so forth.
So what did the burlesque houses look like? Were they set up?
They were very nice.
They were very nice.
They were very nice. They were they were money makers, had been for a long time. They were pretty large. They were kept clean, and there was no shenanigans. There was no um, doing things that you wouldn't want to be seen doing.
Mm-hmm.
It was at the theater. It was like going to a movie, except there were a lot of naked women, and not always naked. Many times they were dressed.
But there were many costumed acts, right?
Many
Lots
costumes,
of comedy,
a lot of comedies, um,
live music.
a lot of music. It had a pit orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In fact, one of the guys that later played in our orchestra was when I first met him. He was playing in the burlesque theater.
What was the audience like?
The audience was generally sailors young guys being off the ships, and military men who were on break. It was a great thing for them to be able to, instead of killing Germans, to be able to.
You know, your story reminds me. David and I watched a movie about the start of the West End, the British theater scene. And it started off a lot the same way, where
Sure.
most of the audience was sailors and young people returning from war, and they really wanted a way to.
But I will say that some of these people became very talented. Obviously, you know the fact that quite a few of them became top-notch movie stars later on. Not all of them. Some of the women were more effective at their jobs. Some of them overdid it. Occasionally, the theaters would be raided by the police when somebody had done things. There were things, for example, you couldn't expose, a woman could not expose her nipples. And they generally didn't. They had pasties, they call them, glued over their nipples. But there would be times when everybody was hollering and.
Well, you know, they had the same thing in England too. They had this issue about how much the women would move, and so to spoof this, the English theaters put the women up there, and they remained perfectly still, like a painting, so that they could call it art. There's all sorts of things that went on in the burlesque. That must have been really pretty cool.
So it was pretty cool, especially for a young guy who was not as old as these other guys. That I couldn't have got in by myself.
Yeah.
But since I went with some of the other mechanics and they invited me to go along, then nobody bothered me.
So since you were young, you were under 20. So we're still before 1950. So do you remember when this burlesque theaters kind of phased out? When TV kicked in, or?
Yeah, well, it was in the 50s.
Yeah.
They were still going. That's about the mid 50s they began to. For a long time they held it. There still are burlesque theaters.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And they made a living, but they didn't make a good living.
What did the young adults do then? What did they switch to? You remember? What did they do instead? I guess actually it was the rise of the car, wasn't it?
I don't know what it was.
Yeah, something changed. It'd be interesting to know. Well, let's go on to the next thing.
Sure.
Let's see.